Welcome, friends, to another episode of Truth for Life. Again, my name is Dr. Mark Sandoval. It's a pleasure to go on this journey with you to freedom and to healing. Today, we're going to be looking at the plan of salvation and how God intends to fix this problem that we're in. How much good does our fallen nature have? Well, it has nothing good. And how evil is our fallen nature? Well, it's all evil. So can the fallen nature produce anything good? And the answer is no. A bad tree cannot produce good fruit. And that's what Jesus said in Matthew 7, verse 18. So can the fallen nature fix the problem through the fallen nature? Can it solve its own problem? The answer is no. If a computer's operating system is corrupted, can you fix the corrupted computer operating system with the very same corrupted operating system? The answer is no. So, to try to fix your deception through the very thing that is deceived is futile. It won't work. It's not possible. How many people are caught in an addiction because they want to be caught in an addiction? How many people are a slave to alcohol because they want to be a slave to alcohol? How many people are a slave to pornography because they want to be a slave to pornography? How many people are a slave to TV and movies because, well, they want to be? Nobody is a slave to anything because they want to be a slave. Everybody was created to be free. Nobody wants to be a slave. Now, yes, people are addicted to what they're addicted to, not because they like being a slave, but because they can't get out of the prison that they're in. And yes, their fallen nature likes the evil or certain aspects of it, but they want to get out of the prison, but they're trying to stop the addiction, the temptation, the whatever. They're trying to get out of the prison with the very nature that put them in prison and keeps them there. And that's not going to work. So if we were created to govern ourselves from the inside and not to be governed from the outside, and if we govern ourselves according to an internal deception that God himself cannot fix from the outside, and if only we can accept or reject information and bring it into ourselves and operate by it, and that information cannot be forced into us, then one of the only ways that we will question our perception of truth is if it doesn't work. Okay? Because truth is associated with function. Error is associated with dysfunction. And if what I think is truth is error, it won't work. So God must maintain cause and effect. And he must do so for our good. Truth is always aligned with function, it works, and error is always aligned with dysfunction, it doesn't work. So if your truth isn't working, it isn't the truth. It's a deception. And you're believing a lie, but believing it to be the truth. So God must allow the negative effects to come from the bad decisions that we make, whether we are aware that those decisions are bad or not. And he does so that we can question our perspective. He must allow circumstances and situations that allow what's inside of us to come spilling out so that we can see what is really inside of us. And God must allow us to spill out while we're around others, and that influences them negatively, but he allows that to happen so that we and they can see our need of him and allow him to save us. It's for our salvation and it's for their salvation. So God must allow the suffering that we hate, because without it, we could never be saved. Without it, we would never question our lost condition. Without it, we would always blame everything outside of us for the problem that only comes from inside of us. Without it, there would be no way of setting us free from the deception of sinful nature. It's painful, but it's necessary. And every consequence that God gave for sin was for the salvation of the sinner. The multiplied sorrow and conception, the painful childbirth, the husband ruling over his wife, the cursing of the ground, the toil for food, the thorns and the thistles, from dust thou art, to dust thou shalt return. All of these were necessary in order for us to see our condition. If Adam and Eve had been left in the Garden of Eden to continue just as they were, they would never know that they had fallen. The consequences were necessary in order to help them to see their condition. So what is the solution? We're going to look at that now. What is the solution? Now, the problems that must be solved is that man is self-deceived and cannot free himself from his self-deception. And man's self-deception causes him to commit sin. And God cannot free man from his self-deception because God cannot act on our behalf. And the problem can only be fixed by a cooperative work, a collaborative work between God and man. And this requires man to bind himself to God from a state of self-deceived separation, and this self-deception does not allow that to happen. So the plan of salvation must have a man who had the problem inside of himself, who would and could connect himself to God somehow, and who through that connection could solve the internal problem and put to death the old nature, the old man, and create a new life with no problem inside of itself. So remember our inheritance. Everybody has a father and a mother. You have genetic information. You get half of your genetic information from father and half of your genetic information from mother. But you also have a spirit, and you get half of the information that makes your spirit from your father and half of the information that makes your spirit from your mother. And so you get a half copy of fallen nature from dad and a half copy of fallen nature from mom. And hence you have certain predispositions, you have certain weaknesses, certain propensities, because you've got your dad and you've got your mom. Now, some people, they complain and they say, well, why would God ever put me in that family? Why would he ever allow me to grow up in that situation? I'll tell you, that's the only way he can have you. It's the only way that he can have you. Because he didn't come along and create you in your mother's womb. He created Adam. And Adam, there was a reproduction, right? And there was a reproduction, and so you got what Adam had, and then Adam's children got what Adam had, and then what Adam's children had, they got their children, and so on and so forth, and it got passed down to you. God doesn't come along and recreate every individual. He created one person, Adam, and even Eve came from Adam, and from that individual was made to reproduce. And each reproduction is a new individual, but you come from the information that was already there and existing. So if Jesus was going to come, if God was going to fix the problem, then Jesus must come in the same way that humanity comes. And he had a mother, and his mother had fallen nature, and he received that half copy of fallen nature from his mother. But he had a father, and he had a heavenly father. And he received a half copy of the unfallen nature from his father. Because a bad tree can only produce bad fruit, and a good tree can only produce good fruit. And he could only get the bad from his mother, and he could only get the good from his father. And so it was an interesting situation with him. So he had Mary as his mother, She had genetic information. Half of the information that made up his body came from Mary. And yes, it had mutations, it had defects, it had the effects of sin for 4,000 years. And she had a fallen nature, and so half of the information that made up his spirit came from Mary, which had the fallen nature as well. But that was not his only parent. He had God as his father. And from his Father, through the Holy Spirit, he received the other half of his genetic information, which was perfect. Okay? Father doesn't create anything bad. And that made up half of the information that made his body. And from his Father, he received the true identity that I'm a child of God. And that's what he received, and that made up half of the information that made his spirit. And so he had fallen nature from his mother, and he had unfallen nature from his father. And behind all of it, he was God. And so, we can't understand, wrap our minds around all of this. We can understand the human part of things because humanity operates under law. We can't understand the God side of things because God doesn't operate under law. He's outside of and above law. So, here Jesus had this situation. And from his birth and from his conception, he was challenged. He had a struggle, you might say. He had access to the fallen nature, but he had access to the unfallen nature. And by the unfallen nature and the true identity that I'm a child of God, he connected himself to the Father by trust. And by faith, he took from the Father what he needed, and he filled up from his Father. And so Jesus never took his earthly parents as his source. He never took his siblings as his source. He never took a person around him as his source. He had his Father as his source, and he remained bound to his Father because he received that unfallen nature and the correct identity from his Father. And he was tempted throughout his lifetime to take another source. It's interesting when you look at the three temptations in the wilderness, or the one that's pictured here isn't the wilderness, but when you look at the three temptations in the wilderness, you recognize that in the first one, he's being tempted to take his own divinity and to help himself rather than being dependent upon his Father and trusting in his Father as his source. In the second temptation, he's being tempted to trust in people, because to cast yourself off of the top of the temple, well, the temple's always occupied in the Jewish times. And if he comes and he jumps off and then he comes and lightly lands on the ground and whatever, then people are going to be like, oh, and so that would just be miracle working for his own sake and getting people as his source. And then finally, Satan said, well, worship me. So he's tempting him to take Satan as his source. Always tempted to take another source. Always tempted to take another source. But he never did, even to the point of death. To the point of death. And that life was a beautiful life. Now let's look at what happened at the cross, because it's very important for us to understand. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:21, "For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him." Desire of Ages puts it this way: "He, the sin-bearer, endures the wrath of divine justice, and for thy sake becomes sin itself." So on the cross, well, actually, more practically speaking, from the Garden of Gethsemane through his trial and then finally his crucifixion on the cross, Jesus became our sin. I'm not saying he committed sin. I'm not saying he gave in to sin. But I am saying that he became sin. And that's something different. Right? So coming up to the cross, there's the experience of Jesus. And Jesus was fully God and fully man, and he did both perfect. He was perfect. Not by a thought, not by a word, not by an action did he ever sin. Okay. And Jesus took nothing personally from anything anybody ever said or did to him. We're told that not for himself, but for others, he lived and thought and prayed. And when you do everything for the sake of others, when somebody does something bad to you, you don't take it personally as if it's about you. you recognize that what they do and what they say is about them. And yes, he loved them, and yes, he hurt for them. Yes, he sorrowed for them. He was a man of sorrows, and he was acquainted with griefs. Absolutely. Yes, but his sorrow and his grief was not for himself. It was for us. It was for those that were around him and for his Father, because he came to be the delivery person of his Father's goods. And when they took the present that came from the Father and threw it on the ground and stomped on it, well, Jesus didn't take it personally as if it was about him, but he hurt for them and he hurt for his Father. And Jesus was completely selfless, doing everything for the good of others. And he responded perfectly to everything that ever happened. You and I respond because of how things relate to us and how we perceive it and how it affects us. He related to others based upon what it meant to them and how it affected them. Right? And Jesus had good ripples. What do I mean? He had a good influence from his life. What he said and did influenced others positively, and those ripples went out through all time and space. And Jesus had power to do the good and avoid the evil, and Jesus had no baggage. No baggage. Right? He came to the cross with no resentment, no bitterness, no baggage, no nothing. And he had the identity that he was a child of God, and he had the identity that I am a God. But he never lived by the I am God, ever, not even once. It was there and available, but he never lived by it even once. And this life deserves eternal life that is a child of God and lives as a child of God, never living with that sinful nature. And Jesus, in himself, brought that sinful nature to the cross, that I am God. And that sinful nature must be solved. It must be resolved. It's a problem, and it's a problem that must be fixed. And so Jesus must he must resolve that problem in himself. Because God couldn't get into the problem from the outside in other humans, and so he had to bring the problem inside of himself as a human. And he fixed the problem in himself, and finally on the cross he put it to death in himself. And when he cried out, "It is finished," he had put the sinful nature to death. He had fixed the problem. And then the rest of him must die. He made him who knew no sin to be sin for us. Well, what's our situation coming to the cross? Well, we're fully human and none of the divine, and we don't do the human part very well. So we have a full copy of the I am God, and so he was perfect, we are sinful. He took nothing personally, we take everything personally. He was selfless, we are selfish. He responded perfectly to everything that ever happened, and we don't respond so perfectly, and so we become a perpetrator to others. And he never saw himself as a victim because he recognized that anything that happened to him was by his Father's permission. And he knew that his Father only permitted what was going to work out for good, and so he never saw himself as a victim. He came here willingly. But you and I, we sure see ourselves as a victim of what others say and do to us. Sure. He had good ripples throughout all time and space. We have bad ripples. Right? The effect that we have and the influence that we have on others is not so good. He had power to do the good and avoid the evil, and you and I are powerless to do the good and avoid the evil. But we seem to have a lot of power to avoid the good and do the evil. He came to the cross with no baggage, and you and I come to the cross with baggage, absolute baggage. And our life deserves death, right? Our life deserves death. For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So, what did Jesus do on the cross? He became our life. He became our sin. And so there on the cross, as our substitute and our surety, like the lamb and the sacrificial service, Jesus took our sin. He took our nature. He took our problems. He took our issues. He took our past. He took everything, and he became it himself. So on the cross, who was it that was selfish? Oh, it was Jesus. I mean sinful. It was Jesus. Now, I'm not saying he sinned. I'm saying that he became sin. On the cross, who was it that had taken everything personally throughout his life? Oh, it was Jesus, because he took my life and your life. Who was it that was selfish or selfishness? Oh, it was Jesus. And on the cross, who was it that was the perpetrator? It was Jesus. And who was the unwilling victim? It was Jesus. And who was it that had the bad ripples that you can never get back? It was Jesus. And who was it that was powerless to do the good and avoid the evil? It was Jesus. And who was it that was left with all the baggage? It was Jesus. Everything your life was, he became. And every consequence of your life, he became. For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So there's another exchange on the cross. Oh, and Jesus did not remain with the old nature. He became a new creature on resurrection. Now, there's another exchange, and that exchange is when you and I enter into the experience of the cross. Whose life, what life do we get? What nature do we get? Whose power do we get? What do we get? We get everything of the life of Christ. For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So when you and I enter into the experience of the cross, who is it then that is perfect? That's us. And when you and I enter into the experience of the cross, who is it that has never taken anything personally, ever? It's us. And when you and I enter into the experience of the cross, who is it that is selfless? It's us. And who is it that has responded perfectly to everything that has ever happened, ever? It's us. And who is it that has the good ripples, the good influence throughout all time and space? Well, it's us. And who is it that has power to do the good and avoid the evil? It's us. And who is it that is left with no baggage? It's us. Everything that Christ's life was, we become. And the life, the eternal life that is his, becomes ours. So on the cross, we see that there is an exchange of life for life, past for past, history for history. And this exchange is made available to everyone by the grace of God. And it is made available to each one and made their own by faith. The grace makes it available to everyone, but faith must accept it for myself, right, that it might be mine. Now, when I enter into the experience of the cross, I give God all of my heart that I'm aware of, but it's just a little bit. And you notice that over time it grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. By faith, I get the new creature of the resurrected Christ. And that is here. But I also still have the old nature of the I am God, and we see that here and here outside of these kind of blue lines. And so now I have a struggle, a real struggle, because now I still have the I am God, and now I have the new creature that's growing inside. What is that growth process like? We're going to talk about that in just a second. Right. But let's go back to the cross and before the cross. Let's say that before you come to the cross, let's say that you had an argument with somebody, and in that argument, You got into a pretty, it got to be a very heated argument. And after that argument was over, you were the only person standing, and the other person there was, well, they're on the ground. They're not moving, they're not breathing, and they're a bit bloody. And you realize that you are the one that killed them. So you're a murderer. And now, oh man, you start thinking about it, and you start thinking, oh no, what's going to happen, and how is this going to go, and you know, how, what's going to happen when people find out, and you don't like the idea of prison, and so now you go and you get the body, and you get the evidence, and you hide it all, and you do something with it, and now you can go, now you hide it, and you do it well, and nobody finds out what you're doing. Nobody finds out that you have done it. Right? And so now you get away with it. Maybe after a year you move away from that community so it doesn't look too suspicious. And you know, you continue being free in your body, but you're captive in the mind, because everywhere you go, there you are. And you remember what you did. And you wonder who's going to find out. And when they find out, what's going to happen. And, you know, and so there's this anxiety, there's always this looking over your shoulder and wondering, and there's guilt that follows you everywhere that you go, and you just can't get away from it. Right? And one day you find out about the cross, and you realize that what God is offering to you is He's offering the capacity for you to come to the cross and to exchange your life with the life of Christ. And that in coming to the cross and exchanging your life with Him, that you get to go free. And that it is no longer you, but it is Christ that becomes the murderer. You get to go free. When you enter into the experience of the cross, and when faith takes a hold of that gift, who is it now that is no longer the murderer? That's you. Because Jesus takes your place. Now you might say, but I actually did it in reality. Well, okay. All right. But how much of your place does He take? Enough to account for reality? Yes, for sure. Now, of course, you learn about confession and repentance and other things of these nature, and that's all part of the process as well. And you realize that there are, you know, loved ones that are wondering what happened to their loved one, and you know, and so it's appropriate for you to confess what happened, and you do, and the authorities find out, and they put you on trial, and you end up in prison. You get to be exactly where you didn't want to be. Exactly where you didn't want to be. In prison. But are you in prison guilty, or are you in prison innocent? All right, so that seems like a little conundrum that's there. Well, if we think of our judicial systems, at least in the United States, well, if you have lower courts and you have higher courts, and if the lower court says that you're guilty, but the higher court says that you're innocent, well, you get to go free. Is an earthly court or the heavenly court higher? Which one? Well, the heavenly court. And if the heavenly court says that you're innocent, but the earthly court says that you're guilty, what are you? Okay. Well, you're innocent. And does the heavenly court make any mistakes? No. It's the earthly court that makes mistakes, not the heavenly one. So now your captivity has changed. Before you were free in the body, but captive in the mind. And now you're captive in the body, but you're free in the mind. And which would you rather be? Well, I would rather be free in the mind, because that's who I really am. Right? Now, let's say that you had been in a family where you had not been taken well care of. In fact, the ones that should have nourished you neglected you. The ones that should have accepted you rejected you. The place where you should have been and you should have belonged, you were not accepted. The ones who should have protected you perpetrated upon you, and so on. And nothing went right. And this is your experience in growing up. And your home of your youth was hell. And as you grew up, well, at the beginning you didn't know. You just knew that, hell was what you knew. That's all you knew. And so, but as you grow up, you begin to realize, hang on, it's not like that everywhere. And you realize that, oh, this is a problem. And you eventually get big enough and you run away from that. And you find your prince or princess charming. The one that's going to save you from the hell. The one that's going to accept you and love you and protect you and so on. And they end up being the same hell that you left. And so you run from one hell to another hell to another hell. Always in hell. And you can't help but hate them. You can't help but resent them. You can't help but not like them. You can't, no matter what you try to do, love them. You just can't. And today you find out about the cross. And you realize that what Jesus is offering to you is he's offering to take your place. He's offering to exchange with you. He will enter into your past, your timeline, your history. He will become you for you. He will take your parents. He will take your genetics. He will take your hormones. He will take your environment. He will take the chemicals you've been exposed to. He will take the people you have been around. He will take the neglect and the abuse and the abandonment and the molestation and the rejection and all of that kind of stuff. And he will take the hell that you lived in your home. He will take the recognition that hell was not so good and the decision to go off into Prince or Princess Charming's arms and then the hell that came from that. And he will take everything that your life has ever been and all the hell that you have ever suffered and all of the resentment that you have had, the bitterness you have held against them and your inability to love them. And he will take all of that in himself and he will put it to death in himself on the cross. And in himself on the cross, he looks to the Father and he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Father, they're crazy. They're crazy. So there's a chance to save them. If they weren't crazy, what could we do? And faith takes a hold of the gift. And in that moment, who is it that did not live through all of that hell and take it personally? Who is it that did not have the bitterness and the resentment? It's Jesus. It's not me anymore. Right? Because he takes my place. You see, the cross offers you the opportunity to go free because Jesus takes your place. Whether that's freedom from being the perpetrator or that's freedom from being the victim, you get to go free. Now, when you first enter into that, when you first, by faith, accept that gift, and you accept that he sets you free, not because you feel like it, but because you need it. And when faith takes a hold of that gift and makes it yours, eventually, yes, there is a lightness that comes from that. Eventually, yes, there is a freedom that comes from that. It might not come right away. Don't wait for the feeling or that experience to come before you will believe. No, you must believe. Based upon the promise itself, not based upon how you feel. But now that you have accepted that gift, you enter into the cross and the life of Christ, and you don't just get forgiveness. You don't just get forgiveness. You get power, right? You get the good effects of the life of Christ. You get good decisions. You get not taking things personally. You get his selfless love. You get everything of the life of Christ in that gift on the cross. It's all yours. If all you think you get at the cross is forgiveness, that's all you're going to get out of the cross. But if you get everything of the life of Christ at the cross, then you will get everything of the life of Christ through the cross, right? So recognize that there is far more there available to you than you thought there would be. Now, when I enter into that experience of the cross, and I exchange my life with the life of Christ, I accept that exchange on my behalf. Now, yes, I have that freedom. But now I'm like a baby who has stood up for the first time. And if I'm a baby that's down, and now I stand up for the first time, how long am I going to stand up? Not very long. Right? It's not going to be very long before, poof, I fall down. But what does a baby do in order to learn how to walk? Well, you get back up. Right? You get back up. So, how many times does it take for a baby to fall in the process of learning how to walk? How many falls are necessary? I don't know. You don't know. How many times did you fall in the process of learning to walk? You don't know. How many times did I fall in the process of learning to walk? I don't know. But whatever it was okay. Right? If you... Yes. If you fell and your parents went, "Oh, you are such a disgrace to the family. I just can't believe you are just, You're gonna get up sometime? Come on now. Big boy, big girl. Come on, get back up. Don't go groveling around and all that kind of stuff. Oh, you play sniggly, whatever. And come on, get up. And then you get up. They're like, that's good. Good boy, good girl. And then you fall again. And when you fall again, you're stupid. I can't, whatever. Right? If every time you fell, you were treated like that, what motivation would you have to get back up? It'd be safer to stay down. Right? You wouldn't want to keep getting up. You would want to stay down because you get beat up every time that you get up. God is not like that. God is not there to beat you up when you fall down. That's not what he does. That's not what he's like. He's excited that you're learning how to walk. If you have a child that is learning how to walk and it's about to take its first step, you don't go to beat it up. It's like slow motion. You're like, you're trying to get the picture. And the baby takes one step and falls down, and you're like, woohoo, hooray, right? This is great. Right? This is great. and so, yes, it's beautiful, right? You love it when the child walks. It's okay when the child falls. Every parent knows a child falls in the process of learning to walk. That's okay. Just get back up. Just get back up. And God is better than a good parent. If you had a good parent, God is better than that. If you had a bad parent, God is much better than that. He doesn't beat you up when you fall down. He encourages you to get back up. So, by faith, we enter into the experience of the cross. Right? It's by faith that we enter into it. How do you get out of it? By doubt. Right? You doubt it, and you're right back over here. Now, this is our background. This is our normal thing. We're used to living here. This is what life looks like normally. And so when you first accept by faith that gift of entering into the cross, you're not going to be here very long before, boom, you're right back. Right? Well, okay, what do you do? If you're back here and you're taking the bitterness and the resentment and the guilt and all that kind of stuff again, you're seeing yourself as the victim and the perpetrator and whatever, and you think that you're powerless, what do you do? Well, just like before. By faith, you take a hold of the gift and you enter into the life of Christ. You accept the perfection of his life on your behalf, and you accept it as your very own, and you're back up, and you're up again. But what's going to happen after a little while? You're going to fall down, and you'll be right back here. And so it's a process of back and forth, and so on. Or I should say back and forth and back and forth. You can never be up and down at the same time. But up and down are part of the same process. It's part of the same process. Right? And it's okay. And over time, you spend less and less time over here, and you spend more and more time over here. And on a particular area, a particular part of your life, there's a growth process, right? There's a growth process where we begin to grow more and more into the likeness of Christ. Now, before I come to the cross for the first time, all I have is the fallen nature. That's it. That's all I've got. But when I come and I enter into the experience of the cross, when there's the new birth experience in me, now by faith I have access to Christ, the new creature that knows that I'm a child of God. And now, I have the same advantage of Jesus. The advantage that he has, he gives me. And so now I have access by faith through him to the new nature. And yeah, there's still the old man of sin that's there, but now begins a battle. Now begins a process. And my bottle gets knocked over. Circumstances and situations come so that what's inside of me still, where the lie is still there in my heart, can be revealed. And when it comes spilling out, then I see it and I go, I don't like that. Don't like it at all. Well, what do? You get back up. You bring it to the cross, right? You accept that divine exchange on your behalf again. And if you fall, okay, well, you get back up. God's not there to beat you. He's there to help you. He's there to encourage you. He loves you. You are his child. You get back up. And how do you get back up? You enter right back into the experience of the cross. Right? And you accept the divine exchange of the life of Christ on your behalf, and you enter into the life of Christ. Right? Now, what do we do with temptation? Now, how do we handle temptation? We'll just cover it briefly now. There'll be a whole other presentation on it later, but how do we handle temptation? We're told that you cannot change your heart. You cannot of yourself give to God its affections. But you can choose to serve him. You can give him your will. He will then work in you to will and to do according to his good pleasure. Thus, your whole nature will be brought under the control of the Spirit of Christ. Your affections will be centered upon him. Your thoughts will be in harmony with him. So let's examine this a little bit. We need to examine it. So what is it telling us? It's telling us that you cannot change your heart, and your heart is where you have your treasure. It's where you have your gains and your losses. So you can't by yourself change what you consider to be a loss and what you consider to be a gain. You can't consciously do that. That's not something that's accessible to the conscious mind. And the heart is also what you're attracted to, right? Where your gains are. And so you cannot change what you are attracted to. You cannot change what you consider to be a gain or a loss, but you can choose to serve him. You can give him your will. And this is not a natural choice available to you in your sinful fallen human nature. This is a supernatural choice that is given to you by God, that is outside of your capacity of your sinful nature. You're not naturally in your sinful nature able to have this choice. But when you reach out for that supernatural choice that is available to you, when faith takes a hold of the gift, then God will work in you to will and to do what you could never will and do for yourself. There will be an empowerment, an empowering of the facilities or the faculties and the capabilities that God has given to you, and He will empower those things because now you are in cooperation with Him in it. And now what you could not do before, you are enabled to do. And in temptation, you cannot stop being attracted to the temptation. Right? The thing that's tempting you while you're in the process of temptation, you can't just make yourself not be attracted to it. You can't. Remember, it says that you cannot change your heart. You cannot choose to avoid the evil and go against your very nature with the nature that goes in that direction. Right? So you can't use the nature that goes after evil to not go after evil. Can't do it. Right? But you can choose to serve Him. You can give Him your will. He will then work in you to go against your nature, to resist the temptation, and to choose something good instead. And it's not a possession where He comes in and takes possession of you. No, He created you to self-govern. And He will never take over that self-government. He will respect that and honor that under all conditions and all circumstances. But when you are open and available to Him, now He can empower your choices, and you will submit and surrender to His influence in your life, and then you will begin to make your choices in harmony with Him. Right? Again, it's not of a possession type of thing. So He will work in you by you making choices and cooperating with Him, and Him empowering that, and you cooperating together with Him. Right. So as you surrender your will repetitively to Him, like this, He changes your heart over time. It's not you that's changing your heart. It's Him that's changing your heart, because you can't change it. You can't give it. That's a work that He must do. And so you can only do something consciously, and that is choosing whom you will serve. He works on the unconscious that you cannot work on. And He changes the heart so that you begin to see gain where you only saw loss before. And you begin to see loss where you thought it was gain before. And because the heart always goes after the gain and always avoids the loss, if it thought loss was gain, it continued pursuing loss, thinking it was pursuing gain. And God comes in and He changes the heart so that now you actually begin to see gain as gain, and you go after it. And you begin to see loss as loss, and you avoid it. And in this way, you progressively grow into the likeness of the image of Christ. It's not something that happens, boom, just like that, but it's something that takes time, and it's okay for it to take time. But when that happens and that process goes to its final conclusion, then you will naturally serve God because your heart will be in harmony with His. And that's what we're told here in this passage from Desire of Ages. All true obedience comes from where? From the heart. It was heart work with Christ. And if we consent, he will so identify himself with our thoughts and aims, so blend our hearts and minds into conformity to his will, that when obeying him, we shall be but carrying out our own impulses. The will, refined and sanctified, will find its highest delight in doing his service. When we know God as it is our privilege to know him, our life will be a life of continual obedience. Through an appreciation of the character of Christ, through communion with God, sin will become hateful to us. Isn't that beautiful? Yes, it will become hateful to us. You see, you and I have been trapped in a prison. We were born in it, and we were raised in it. And it's a prison with no hope of parole. There's no way of getting out on your own. And at the beginning, you might not know that you're a prisoner. You usually don't. I mean, a child growing up in a home doesn't know that it's an abusive home, really, until later they realize that, oh, not every home is this way. But you, as a little one, you don't know that you're in prison as you grow up and so on. But every once in a while, you run into a wall that you can't get through. Well, I mean, you can't get through walls here, but you can find a way around. And if you can find a way around and get to wherever you want to go, well, you're not captive, you're free. But if you finally want to go somewhere and you find that you can't get there, and in fact, there's many places you want to go and you can't get there, and you try this way and you try that way and you try the other way and you try that wall and you try that wall and you try that way, and you realize you can't get through, you can't get through, you can't get through, you can't get through. Eventually you start getting the idea, maybe I'm in prison. Maybe I can't get out. Right? And so, born in this situation, you don't necessarily recognize it, but circumstances and situations come where you can't help but respond in certain ways, and you know that they're wrong, but you can't help it, and you try. And circumstances and situations come, and you respond, and you know it's wrong, and you can't help it, and you try. And it keeps happening, and it keeps happening, and it keeps happening, and you try different ways, and you try different ways, and you try different ways. You try that wall, that wall, that wall, that way, that way, that way, that way, and eventually you start get the idea, I'm captive. Now, you will never seek for the real way of being free if you think you can get your way of being free. So God will allow you to try as many ways as you think you need to try in order to go free, in the process of convincing you you're not free. Now, he's not trying to convince you that you're not free because he's the one that put you in prison. No, you're the one that put you in prison. It's your own nature. Now, you were born with it. You're not responsible for it, but it's yours, and you operate in a prisoner way. And he can't just set you free from that, because he can't set you free from it if you don't know it is the thing. And so if you think you're free, he can't set you free. So you got to know you're captive before he can ever set you free, because he has to offer you a pardon. And if you're not going to accept a pardon if you can just walk out. So this prison is a prison of my nature. It's not a prison of concrete walls. It's a prison of my nature. And there I am in prison. Right? There I am. I'm in prison. And in that prison, I have choices. There are choices in prison, but they're captive choices. I have no access as a prisoner to free choices outside of the prison. And when you think you have free choices when you're actually a captive and having captive choices, you'll wonder why you make the choices that you do. And you'll beat yourself up for not making free choices when you're a captive and you only have captive choices. And you will continue to only have captive choices as long as you think you're free. It's only when you finally realize that you're actually captive that you will turn to him and accept his salvation. Before that, you only need a helper. You don't need a savior. And so as a prisoner, you have no choice for freedom unless a choice is given to you. And God gives you that choice through the cross, through the life of Christ, that you can go free from being a prisoner. And when you accept that pardon, that offer for the pardon, then you accept that offer for that pardon when you are in the prison cell. And now there's a process that must be put in place in order to set you free. And that process, the officer says, "Come, follow me, we're going this way." If you go run the opposite way, you're not going free. If the officer says, "Come, follow me, we're going this way," and you stay there in your cell and you say, "I'm not going anywhere," well, you're not going free. If the officer says, "Come, follow me, go this way," and you tackle the officer and grab them and stick the gun to their head and say, "Get me out of here now," you're not going free. And if the officer says, "Come, follow me, we're going this way," and you burst past the officer, you run that way, you get down to the door, "Get me out, get me out, get me out now," you're not going free. The only way you're going free is if you follow the instructions of the officer while he's setting you free. Anytime you try to take over your freedom process and do it your way, you'll find out you're a captive. The only way you go free is if you follow in the process that is put in place for you to set you free. And this is not a prison. It's not a prison of murder. It's a prison of hatred. It's not a prison of rape. It's a prison of lust. It's not a prison of theft. It's a prison of greed. It's not a prison of forgery, it's a prison of dishonesty. It's not a prison of actions, it's a prison of motivations. It's not a prison of crime, it's a prison of sin. And so the process of setting you free, by the time you step foot out of that prison, the process of setting you free must remove from you every motivation, every thought, everything that causes you to be a prisoner, so that when you come and you set foot in freedom, you have no more of that prisoner nature in you at all. You are free, and you will never be subjected to that again. You are a free person, and you will not harm free society. And that is the freedom that God has for you. And he offers it to you as at the cross. And that will be the beginning of a process that will carry you all the way to freedom from the sinful nature and sin itself entirely. You want it? You can have it.